The year is 2031. During an appearance on Game Nights, writer and actor John Hodgman reads a list of the most popular commanders according to EDHREC.
Number 1, Stew Builder Dennis. Number 2, Charlie the Egg. Number 3, Holden the Expert Dream Twister. Number 4, the RZA. Number 5, Jack Skunk. Number 6, Jack Skunk Feast. Number 7, Lord Dan X Still Standing. Number 8, Marlon Fitzfancy. Number 9, Bazino, the kid whose hair is on fire. Number 10, Whispering Lies Magruder. Number 11, Knit Louse. Number 12, Daniel Dinsmore Takadu. Number 13, Hobo Zero. Number 14, The Silver Jacket Man. Number 15, No Shoulders Small Joe.
Ready?
I suppose.
All right, then welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy. I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, Rotisserie Coward Maddox.
Oh, yeah. Since
What, you afraid? You afraid? You afraid to fight me, boy?
I'm not afraid.
Well, what are you then? Just busy?
Distracted.
Distracted? Rotisserie distracted?
Other words for disengaged, confused.
We finished a rotisserie draft of friend of the show, Parker, a.k.a. Land of Mordor's Cube, like 2 weeks ago at this point? And
It's been a while. I'm sorry.
You have gotten in a resounding 2 matches with your deck.
That's all me.
And one of them was not against me. I aim to destroy you.
I consider me destroyed.
I have some brags and bad beats. Quick sidebar for brags and bad beats around this Roto draft.
Reveling in victory. That's brag. Drowning in defeat.
That's beats.
I'll tell you all about it on Brags and Bad Beats.
I really liked my deck, which is a mistake. You should never really like your deck, because then you're only setting yourself up
That
for
is quite
failure.
a take. But sure. Yeah. In that context, sure.
Yeah, you should never be like, I did it. I got there. And I really thought I did it, and I got there. I drafted this red-white Luris Burn deck, and we're in Roto drafting this cube, which has tons of fixing, so my mana is perfect. The fact that I'm splashing white is nothing. I'm basically splashing white for Luris, for 2 Lightning Helixes, and for Clarion Spirit. Otherwise, I'm like mono red, spells matter burn. Got this little artifact sub package with Mishra's Bauble and Urza's Saga. I can buy back the Bauble with the Luris. It's a whole thing. Lots of late game value. Tons of burn to the face. This environment turns out to be not super conducive to this particular kind of deck. I mean, I'm doing okay. Right now, I'm 3-2. I think I have a chance of maybe going 5-2, but I had higher hopes. I've lost some games to extraordinarily bad beats that I'm now going to whine about on the podcast. I put Krark the Thumbless in my deck.
Oh, no.
Krark the Thumbless is a card that Parker's included in his cube that I've been curious about because I love casting spells. You know that. I love cheap spells. Theoretically, Krark is good with casting cheap spells because bouncing a cheap spell back to your hand, not that punishing in a lot of circumstances, especially if you have any kind of prowess, spells matter stuff, which I have a decent bit of.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like the dream.
Right. So in theory, you can draft and build your deck such that the downside of Krark, which is that the outcome of casting... I should read Krark. It's a 2-mana 2/2. When you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you flip a coin. If you win the flip, you copy the spell. If you lose the flip, you put the spell back in your hand.
So on average, it's the same, right?
Yeah. Well, on average, yeah, you pay twice as much for twice the effect. So on average, it does come out in the wash.
But you get this potential of getting extra spell cast triggers and extra variance. So sometimes it just doesn't do what you want it to do.
Well, we'll get to that.
Okay.
We'll get to that in a moment. Anyway, I have what I think is kind of the perfect deck for it. It would be a little more perfect if I had more cantrips. I don't have the blue cantrips going on, so I don't have those kinds of cheap spells. But I have tons of cheap burn spells. And I have a deck that has lots of spell triggers. I have, Pyromancer, I have Clarion Spirit, I have multiple 1-mana creatures with prowess. I've got all kinds of good stuff going on there. And in theory, I feel like I should be able to optimize Krark the Thumbless. I put it in my main deck, I played my first match, and I lost the match because, Anthony, my opponent was at 6. I have Krark the Thumbless in play. I have 4 red mana available. I draw Chain Lightning.
That sounds perfect.
I say, perfect, can't lose. Now, this Chain Lightning actually kills my opponent instead of just putting them to 3. I have to figure stuff. Like, if I didn't have Krark, I'd have to remove something in play and try and attack for more damage. But I have Krark. I'm like, this is great. I just got to win 1 out of 4 flips, which, if you crunch the numbers, is like a 94% chance you're going to win 1 out of 4 flips. Listener, let me tell you, I cast it, bounced. Cast it, bounced. Cast it, bounced. Cast it, and bounced again. Then my opponent thought seized it, and I lost the game. And I'm so very mad at
So they went down to 3 when your chain lightning's now gone?
They went down to 4 because they were
four.
at 6. They went down to 4 with the chain lightning gone, yeah, and then managed to gain some life and crawl back out of that deficit and win the game. And at that moment, I removed Kark from my main deck, and I also removed it from my pool spiritually. I just removed it completely. I will not be playing that card ever again in my life.
It is so funny how variance feels different. Like, you could have just
That's the whole thing.
not drawn the chain lightning, and you also wouldn't have been better
I
off.
also
Like,
have
there's-
lightning bolt, lightning strike, lightning helix. My
Sure.
deck
I'm
is
just
full
saying,
of
like,
redundancy for the burn spell.
I don't think it would have felt punishing in the same way. Because if you're saying, okay, sure, maybe you even had like a 30% chance to draw a burn spell that would win on the spot there, but just being comfortable with those odds, like, cool, this turn I have 30% chance to draw a spell that'll end the game, versus I have a 94% chance of this working. Like,
knowing
that
the actual,
kind of variance
knowing the actual outcome is kind of rough. Yeah.
That's pretty punishing.
Yeah. Anyway, that's my bad beat. I also played Robber of the Rich and like 4 times in a row, exiled all lands, and then lost that game also, which also felt bad. Look, I like Parker's Cube. I think Parker has well pursued his goals and embodied his goals well in his cube, but ultimately my main outcome from this rotisserie draft is feeling very self-assured in my decisions to not play Robber of the Rich and Croc the Thumbless in my own environment because I don't like it.
So it's not your fault, it's the cube's fault.
No, I started this by saying I thought I drafted well, but I didn't. I have copped to the fact that my deck is not as good as I thought it was for a variety of reasons, largely coming down to my misevaluation of what is good in this environment. There's a lot of life gain, and so I feel like burn is much worse here than I initially credited it as. Anyway, that's my brags and bad beats from Parker's Roto draft. 4 flips in a row. I even sandbagged the last mountain in my hand, so the first 3 missed, and my opponent was like, I survived somehow. Then I was like, haha, another mountain, another red mana, cast it again, and then that one also missed. They had a good time, I think. I mean, if we're talking about, fun being zero-sum, I think my opponent really enjoyed me missing on 4 flips in a row for them to survive.
Yeah, that's got to be some fun tension.
Yeah, that's really something. Cool card, that Goblin.
Cool
though.
and great.
I even have Dreadhorde Arcanist, too, so I have the Dreadhorde Arcanist Kark combo, which I also wasn't permitted
Does
to
it
do.
put it back in your hand if you
Puts
cast
it back
it from
in
your
your
hand?
hand,
That's pretty
yeah.
messed up.
Yeah, if you either doubles it or
right.
puts it back in your hand. It does one of the two, which is way better than exiling, which is what normally happens with Dreadhorde Arcanist. This is not an episode dedicated to the rotisserie draft of Parker's Cube. Though honestly, Parker, if you want to come on and talk about it, I'm not opposed because I think people learn a lot from rotisserie drafts. And I hear that Parker took the time and dedication to actually build these decks in paper so he and Kennedy could play them in person.
That really puts me to shame that not only have I only played 2 of my matches, but he's also played everyone else's matches. I'm sorry. We're working on a cool project. I'm a little in the weeds.
Anthony is preoccupied with a particularly cool project that has really grabbed you, if I do say so myself. But
I'm really excited about it.
We'll talk more about that at some point in the future. Maybe the far future. I'm not promising anything anytime soon.
I'm
everybody.
promising before the end of February.
Whoa. I mean, that's maybe your work. What about the whole media strategy?
That's I'm telling you, that's the date.
Oh, boy, I got some stuff to do. Anyway, this is not an episode where we talk about Parker's rotisserie draft. This is an episode where we're talking again about Battle Box. Because,
more Battle Box?
Well, yes, we talked about Battle Box last week, Anthony. And we asked the people. I asked them in the episode, do you want to hear more of this soon or later or never? We got, on my count, a total of 5 votes, every single one of them for more Battle Box soon. So if you're out there and you're like, I didn't want this, guess what? You didn't vote. You had exactly, 48 hours since the podcast came out before we record the next one, but you didn't get your vote in time. You didn't say you didn't want it, and so you're getting it. It's more Battle Box content. We are talking about my Battle Box, which I've been noodling on a little bit. I will say it is less tested than yours. I don't have it in paper quite yet, but I'm very pleased with the early playtesting results, and I am going to be building it in paper for sure. There's exactly 1 card I'm just going to proxy for now, and then the rest is very cheap or I already own it. I'm not going to spoil what the Battle Box is yet, Anthony, because I want to just dive right into our opening hands, which we did with
Should we explain very briefly again what Battle Box is?
I think we should, because we
someone
saved
pointed
that.
out that we didn't get to it until 15 minutes into the last episode.
We got to it eventually. Why don't you break it off for me, Anthony?
So generally speaking, Battle Box is a format where players get to play lands for free from outside of the game. Each player has usually 1 of each basic and then 5 guild gates of different color combinations. And then you're playing from the same deck, which is just a mixture of all kinds of other non-land spells chosen by the designer of the box. So it's basically like players have a wide range of different effects. It's not like you're playing a focus deck, and there's no mana screw and mana flood. You just have access to free mana.
Yeah, it's basically just like one of the quickest ways to start playing Magic. There's no shuffling, no deck construction, no drafting. You just put this pile of cards on the table, hand your opponent some lands, and you start playing. It's also, as we've harped on in this podcast before, I think a great sandbox for designing novel kinds of Magic experiences that is less demanding, less complicated than a cube, and also just lets you immediately start playing with the cards you're interested in playing with because there's no additional stuff going on, right? You just do it.
Yeah,
So-
I mean, that's a great point. I think as like an entry point to cube design, it is so much easier in a lot of
So
ways
much easier.
because you're not thinking about, okay, well, there's this challenge of people will draft trap cards or people will draft this one archetype that's going to be overwhelmingly powerful and make the draft feel sort of like meaningless for other players. It's like everybody has equal chance to draw from the same box. You can put like whatever you want in it, and it's not really gonna break. Like the worst case is maybe you have some extreme power outliers where,
But guess what? You just take them out of the sleeve, put them in a different box, and now they're out of the battle box, and there's no other stuff you have to do. There's no requirement for some minimum number of cards. You don't have to sleeve up a bunch of stuff. It's very simple. So we really like it, both as a way to play casual games and also as a way to kind of get into designing your own sandbox environments in a perhaps more accessible, lower barrier to entry way than jumping into designing your whole cube from scratch. So, with that said, your opening hand is only 4 cards in Battle Box because you do get all those lands from outside the game. So, it's kind of like starting with a normal size opening hand, considering you do get to draw an extra land every single turn.
yeah, it's like the perfect opening hand where you always have 3 lands. And
Exactly.
also you have 10 lands.
So you always have 3 lands, and you also draw another land every single turn in addition to drawing a card off the
Exactly.
top of your deck. Let's just dive into our 2 opening hands. No mulligans in Battle Box, at least the way we play. And so I've dealt us out a random opening hand from this Battle Box, and we'll use that as an introduction to what this Battle Box actually is, because it is a departure from what I would describe as normal Battle Box, which a lot of Battle Boxes are all 5 colors. It's kind of like good stuff, board matters, combat matters. It's kind of like plays like limited, retail limited, but in a Battle Box format. And I've taken a very different approach here. So my 4-card opening hand is Jeskai Charm, Velomachus Lorehold, Lose Focus, and Disrupt. And I'm perfectly happy with this opening hand. I have a great big threat in Velomachus Lorehold, this 7-drop 5/5 dragon. I've got a little bit of permission, a little bit of card draw, a little bit of interaction. I'm pretty happy with this. But I won't say more until we get into more about the Battle Box. What's your opening hand, Anthony?
Well, I'm a little bit terrified by that Velomachus over there, but I do have some counter magic that can maybe deal with it. I have a Quicken, a Memory Lapse, Dismiss, and Expansion Explosion.
Have you caught on to the pattern here?
I think I'm feeling the pattern. I think that you started off in a very clear way with this Jeskai Charm.
I sure did. The way I arrived at this Battle Box is that I was thinking about the format, and it occurred to me that, like, Battle Box is just playing the mirror, right? It's just playing the same deck.
Right.
Like, quite literally, a lot of people just put one deck on the table, but it's as if your opponent is playing the same deck you are, which is much like any kind of mirror in Constructed.
Right.
Can't really
There's no rock, paper, scissors of mono green versus, the control deck and then the red aggro deck. It's like, yeah, you're both playing the same deck, always.
Yep. I know that Constructed players, I have not played much Constructed, so I can't really cop to this, but I know Constructed players have a lot of opinions and feelings about which mirrors are fun and which mirrors are incredibly unfun, which mirrors are very high variance. I ran a little Twitter questionnaire. I put a question on Twitter, I don't know, probably a couple months ago at this point. That was just, what are some of the most fun mirrors in Magic across all Constructed Magic? What are some of the most fun mirrors? And I got a bunch of recommendations, but a couple people did mention Jeskai Control, and specifically the notable on-coverage mirror match of Jeskai Control between Ben Stark and Shahar Shenhar at Worlds 2015 or something. I don't remember the exact date. These were like true, I hate to say things like a true control deck, because what is a true control deck? These were draw, go control decks with tons of permission, tons of card advantage. They both had a bunch of copies of Sphinx's Revelation. The games were going until turn 25 and 30 in this mirror match. And basically, the way these games were won is each deck had a couple of finishers, which they had to figure out the right time to try and resolve through a bunch of counter magic and potential interaction. They had Celestial Colonnade, both of them, the blue-white creature land that can be turned into a 4/4 flyer with vigilance. And they had random burn spells that was actually meant for other matchups, like playing against creature decks and stuff where you have to actually remove their threats, that in this control matchup ended up just getting pointed at their opponent's face because they had nothing else to do with it, and they were going to have to discard a hand size because come turn 4, 5, 6, nobody did anything but play lands. I wasn't sure that I loved this kind of Magic gameplay,
so
right?
far I'm a little bit skeptical. Both players just playing lands and waiting for the counter race. Well, let's say it sounds like a cool experience to have every once in a while. So maybe that's the perfect way to encapsulate that experience with a battle box like this.
Right. I didn't look at that and say, that's what I love about Magic. But I was like, that's an interesting thing that I have done very little of. I've definitely played some control mirrors in Cube, where both me and my opponent were on control decks. That's definitely happened before. But that's a lot less extreme than something like this, right? Here, like, their deck is basically half counter spells, a third cantrips, a little bit of removal, and then a few of these big spells they're trying to resolve in between. And so I was curious to try and capture the spirit of Jeskai Control, specifically this kind of era of Jeskai Control, in a battle box, on the presumption that people really like this mirror and think it's a skill testing, interesting mirror to play, where you have to decide what to counter, what not to counter. And that's what I did. I built this Jeskai Control battle box that, first of all, I'll say it leans very heavily blue. So it's Jeskai Control, but if you look at the card list, as I think you are right now, it is overwhelmingly blue cards.
Yeah, I would just call this actually a blue battle box.
It's not too far off. So I kept it to exactly 100 cards. I just chose a round number that was small. I don't want to like push the limits of card quality too much. I want to keep these cards all within a reasonable range of similar power level. And I do want to play some of the most powerful interaction and stuff that I can. And it turns out that just blue has the best cards for this kind of matchup, right? This is a matchup where the stack matters, counter magic is really important. And so blue has a lot of great cards. It's 100 cards, 56 of them are blue, and 34 of them are multicolored, largely in the blue multicolored combinations. There's only 11 cards that are white or red. But that said, I think it still plays out kind of reasonably. So the decisions I made with this box. One, I gave everybody 12 lands instead of 10 lands, because you definitely get to turn 12 in this battle box, in my experience, and I don't think pretty much any game is going to end before that, barring some extreme variance or extreme bad luck where your opponent just decides to tap out for a Baneslayer on turn 5 and you have no answer, which I guess could theoretically happen. Mostly, the games are going to go quite long. I also gave both players a Celestial Colonnade, which is a bold thing to do, I think, in Battle Box, giving both players a very, very strong threat just in their quote-unquote command zone, in their free zone. They get to play for whatever. But I wanted this to mirror that matchup, and that matchup is largely dominated by Celestial Colonnade, by when do I have enough mana to animate my creature land, still have mana up to protect it with counter magic if my opponent tries to destroy my land, and get in for 4 every now and then. And that has actually played out and been true in the playtesting. And blue cards just turned out to be way better. The other thing I did, which I'm really happy with, is I leaned into big Baneslayer style threats. I literally have Baneslayer Angel in the battle box. That is in, I think, just Ben Stark's deck list from that particular Worlds. I think Shahar was playing Thundermaw Hellkite or one of a different finisher. But Baneslayer Angel was part of that deck, and it's the perfect kind of threat for what I want this to be, right? I want you to have to really spend a lot of time to invest a bunch of mana into Baneslayer Angel, find the right window to resolve it, and then slowly beat your opponent down with it while you hold up interaction to keep it and protect it. And that's the kind of gameplay I wanted to actually promote with this battle box. So Baneslayer Angel is in there, as well as basically a collection of cool dragons that I really like. I think dragons are cool, and a lot of them make for cool finishers. So I have Dragonlord Ojutai in here. I have Velomachus Lorehold, which we talked about. I have Bogarden Hellkite, which is the 8 mana card with flash that I think totally shines here. I also included powerful interaction. So there's a lot of good counter magic in here. The removal spells, I think, are kind of suspect. I would include good removal spells. So, for example, I do have Swords to Plowshares in the battle box, which is a very good removal spell. A lot of the other interaction, I think, is a little too narrow, given that your opponent is quite often not going to have a creature. The exact count, I'm looking at this right now, there's 12 creatures out of 100 in the battle box, which is not that many. It's enough that over the course of the game, both you and your opponent are probably going to draw one. Now, that's how the game is going to end, more or less, most of the time. The other thing that makes the creature removal, I think, okay to include is the fact that both players have a colonnade. So in the absence of drawing a creature, you might choose to animate your colonnade, thus turning on your opponent's removal. But I tried as much as possible to include removal that also had other use cases outside of just removing creatures, except for the most efficient ones. I did very intentionally exclude any kind of free interaction. There's no force of will, force of negation, days, any of that stuff, because I think the main game you're playing here is trying to tax your opponent's resources in terms of mana, counter magic, interaction, to generate a window for yourself to actually resolve something meaningful. And that's actually how it's played out, and I'm pretty happy with it. I'm curious to know, we've not spoken about this at all. We've not played it before. You haven't told me what you think about it. What do you think of this particular approach to Battlebox?
I'm really curious to see how it plays out. I definitely appreciate how this lets shine a lot of the things that we always point out are great about Cube and Battle Box. Like, if you're going to play a modern deck, you probably can't play this 7-mana dragon or 8-mana dragon. And if you have a deck that is looking for a big threat, you probably need to find the specific most powerful one. Here, you can just be like, well, this one's cool, and
because you're Fire Song and Sunspeaker in it, and I was like, yeah, this is cool. Like, it's cool, and players are going to cast it because they have to. That's the finisher they're going to draw. Even
more so than in a Cube, it's not like, well, you still have to get people to put it in their deck. Like, you're getting some random cards. Each player needs to figure out how do they actually navigate that situation and get the most value out of their cards. So I do enjoy seeing that aspect of it. I'm a little bit unsure of how that actual gameplay is going to work out. It does sound very technical, potentially very swingy. If you draw your one threat, your opponent has the one removal spell, and that's kind of your only out.
I will say that over a third of the box is counter magic, and the games I've played so far, you assume counter magic. And so...
Sure.
And then you assume your opponent is assuming counter magic.
So you're not just casting your Velomachus on turn 7, you're waiting till turn 9.
Almost certainly
also
not.
Holding up counter spells.
Yeah, so or in the case of Baneslayer Angel, you're not casting on turn 5 almost under any circumstances. Unless your opponent happens to have tapped out on their turn, in which case, what did they do? And did you have an answer for it? Why did they tap out on their turn? It's definitely a weird kind of game theory thing, which I think is how a lot of control matchups go, where you have to decide where your moment to play is. And I think it can be swingy, but it's never swingy in my experience in a way where I had no other options. You always had options. You always had all of these instant speed effects, all of this interaction in your hand. You may have chosen the wrong window because you chose wrong, but I think it's swingy in a different way where it's you messed up and now you get punished for it. And you do get punished pretty hard if your opponent just sticks a threat.
Have you considered adding Krark the Thumbless to this list?
Absolutely not under any circumstances. I'm sorry, what card is that? I have never heard of it. Can you please give me the rules text? That card is gone.
Goblin with no thumbs.
I memory hold that card. I'm never thinking about it ever again.
Wow.
A couple other things I did here. So I mentioned I gave everybody a Celestial Colonnade in the land box. I did. I also, instead of giving them guild gates, gave them a couple of temples. So I gave them 2 of the non-blue-white temple and 1 blue-white temple. So you end up with 6 dual lands, 6 basics in your land pool. I'm not thrilled with this decision. I'm curious to know your take on it. My logic was, this is going to be a slow environment. You're going to play your tap lands first almost all the time. And I thought if I gave people guild gates or whatever, there was absolutely nothing to stop everybody from just every single turn playing tap lands out until you have all 6 in the battlefield and then playing some untapped lands, because there's no reason to not do that.
Sure.
My thought was, I think the scry is much more valuable in the late game.
Yes, definitely.
Where you know what's going on. My opponent now is a threat. I have to be able to remove it. Or I'm looking for that third counter spell to back up the spell I want to resolve, and so I'm trying to find one more piece of interaction, or whatever. My hope was that those would actually come into play later and later turns. Early playtesting, it has felt correct to just play them out early. I gotta say, it still felt correct.
That's believable.
So I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure what other options I would have there, but that was the decision of including the temples in the land zone.
So importantly, you intend for this box to be not played from one stack. You just split the stack in half and each player gets one set, right?
Yeah, so I kept it small, and I guess the one annoying thing, which I know you would avoid because in your battle box you were like, the whole point is play quickly, is I do basically say the rule is start the game by separating this 100 cards into 2 50-card piles, which I think you could probably just do by smushing it down, seeing which one's taller, moving a card over. But that's the idea, and that's, again, I mentioned this in the last episode, it's just that I did want to have scry effects. I did want to have, look at the top X cards, but some of the bottom effects. I did want to have some deck manipulation. I didn't want the battle box to be about that, though, and so the only way to do that is really to just separate the piles and let people have their own deck.
Right, which makes sense. And some people I know do actually play with the temples and the scry effects with a shared library as well. It just means that you're basically fate sealing instead of scrying, which I think is interesting. As we talked about a bunch last week, I feel like that sort of went against what I was looking for in my box, but it definitely can be an interesting effect. And I think here, because there's so much going on, there's like a very specific kind of gameplay and style that you're going for. Adding in that extra element of now you have a bunch of fate seals, I think that would be a little too much. It would be kind of like at odds with, or just one level more than you need to make this effective. It is a bunch of scry though, which I wonder, especially when you're not necessarily using scry the same way you are in a normal game of Magic most often,
which is to get your mana.
Yeah, get rid of lands late in the game where you actually just you have your lands and need your gas like that. That ends up being the decision point: is do I want spells or lands at this point in the game? Whereas here, it's much more about just do I need a threat or an answer or some more card draw, or what actually the scry is doing for you is something different, which is interesting. But I wouldn't be surprised if you keep playtesting and realize, it's kind of just optimal to always play the lands first, in which case you're not really making that much of an interesting sequencing decision, and it does add a lot of just complexity to always have, like, I know I'm going to scry 5 times throughout this game, which is quite a lot.
It is, and I'm definitely not convinced it's the right solution. I think it's the kind of thing that's going to take not just a lot of playtesting, but a lot of conscious trying a thing that otherwise doesn't feel right to me. Because right now, the playtesting I've done, it's like you play the lands early, and the scry decisions, to your point, feel like coin flips. Like, I don't know, like, sure, another counterspell that is maybe not as efficient as the other one I already have, or a cantrip, which is just another card that I have to spend a little mana on, like, do I want this now or later? Like, it always just kind of feels like, sure, whatever. In rare circumstances, I'm like, yeah, that's a Windmill Slam. Or maybe you, like, bottom an 8-mana card because you're scrying on turn 1. You don't want to draw Boggart and Hellkite right now, right? It's not the time for Boggart and Hellkite, so you do bottom that one. But that is kind of rare. Usually it's like, I don't know, I can take it or leave it. And it doesn't feel like it has that much of an impact on the game. But I'm also not convinced that... I think it's very possible that I and others could playtest this battle box for a long time under the assumption that playing tap lands first is better, and just never really fully test the alternative, right? Because in the same way that you can afford to not have mana early because nothing really important happens that early, you can also afford to have 7 mana instead of 6 mana late most of the time, because only when it comes down to actually that counter war, that like, now we're going to fight over the stack of this big spell, does your resources actually matter? And you can get a sense of when that window is, and oftentimes all the counter spells in your hand don't add up to all your mana anyway, so it's not like you'd be using it all in the first place. It really comes down to how many cards you actually have versus the mana you have to spend them. And in that case, having the scry to find more of what you want feels more important. It's the kind of thing where it's like, I don't know how much testing I'll have to do before I'll feel confident in what's actually the correct way to play these scry lands, but I think it's a lot before I feel at all confident in when the correct time to play them is.
Yep, sounds like magic.
It does indeed sound like magic.
It's also funny talking about sort of this play style of the game will often come to a point where there is the counter war, and, you know, players are kind of sandbagging their resources to that point. And we were actually talking about a very similar experience. You know, if we just like say, you know, the cards say take game action, and if you take enough game action, you win. Mm-hmm. That's actually a very similar kind of gameplay to what we were talking about with the first iteration of my battle box, where games would kind of degenerate to players just kind of hold on to their instant speed combat tricks for removal, and then there's this one big turn where you try and play a combat trick and your opponent plays a removal spell and you have another combat trick to protect it. Like, that sounds kind of similar, and that wasn't a lot of fun for me and a lot of people that played that box.
Yeah, I don't know. I agree.
Is it just that people like blue that much more? And as soon as it's a counter spell, that's a lot more fun than
I think it's two things
a
at play here.
blossoming defense.
I think it's two things at play here. I think one of them is that, yes, I think perception is way different. I don't think it's that people like blue more. I think it's that if I tell you it's a Jeskai Control Battle Box and you sit down and play with Jeskai Control Battle Box, that's kind of what you expect.
Right.
If I say, here's my normal battle box, that's normal magic, and then all of a sudden I get in a blossoming defense disfigure war, I'm like, what is this? What's going on? This is not the magic I know and love.
If you're playing my battle box, you should know that that's what you're getting ready for.
Yeah, and then the other thing I think is maybe a factor there, and this may be more of me projecting, I'm not sure, but here's the theory, is that a lot of these counterspells in this battle box are interchangeable. I fully admit that. Like, they're just blue spells that say counter a spell for some different rate with some different upside. But they basically functionally do a very similar thing. There is enough taxing counter magic that is a separate consideration, right? Like, Mana Leak is in this box. Everyone has 12 lands every single game. So is Mana Leak still good? Yes, it is still good. It is differently good. And you can actually play around the Mana Leaks and the miscalcs of the world consciously and say, okay, I'll take this line on the assumption my opponent doesn't have a hard counter spell because it didn't hard counter this last turn, and I thought they would have if they had it. They probably have a taxing counter spell. You can actually make those kinds of assessments. But anyway, there's a lot of kind of spells that are functionally very similar. I do think there is more range to the kinds of combat tricks and stuff you're describing, where I go to disfigure a thing instead of fatal push it, and you have a pump spell. And it's like, well, if I had just had a fatal push, that thing would actually be dead, but you actually had the correct answer. Or on the flip side, like, you know, you're the person that has the pump spell and you get your thing fatal push instead of disfigured. And you're like, there's just so much variation in there that I think it's harder to go into a situation and have a real plan, because what are you playing around? Are you playing around all of the combat tricks and all of the possible instant speed removal? Because there's a big range to what that is. Here it's like, how many counter spells do you have? With the side small adjustment of how many of them are taxing counterspells versus regular counterspells is kind of the one assessment you make.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you're sort of describing two separate sort of aspects of how expectations are really important. One of them being just the expectation of the format as an entire thing. Like, this is...
what are we playing?
Yeah. And so when you say Jeskai Control Battle Box, people are like, okay, we're going to get into a Jeskai Control mirror, and there's a lot of sort of, maybe baggage is the wrong term, but
preconceived notions.
Yeah, preconceived notions, which actually can set people up to have a positive experience. And
or at least say, I don't want to play with Jeskai Control Battle Box. I don't like playing counterspells.
Right.
There's a
so
lot of
actually
Magic
just promoting some self-selection of the right players is a good idea. I like that a lot. That's a powerful concept. And then the other kind of expectation is that, yeah, I mean, it sounds like having a bigger range of diverse effects in a battle box, really in any kind of Magic context, sounds better, right? Like, we want to see more different things happen.
For a lot of goals, yeah. I think the reason that so many Cube designers like Singleton and like drafting is that they want to inject some range into what the possible outcomes are. They don't want to just play... There's a reason we're not playing Constructed. It's not just money.
But there is a positive aspect as well to letting players set up expectations by having a lot of the instant speed interaction be somewhat interchangeable or fall within an expected range.
And again, even in like your old and current battle box, I think with the appropriate expectations that, hey, there's a bunch of white main line effects floating around here, like that expectation can change how you approach the environment. What's the phrase time twist? What's the phrase time twist if not a... We're not doing this again, but I'm not going to get the picture out again. But there's a lot of white main line style cards in that battle box, and I won't hear anything to the contrary. Anyway, with the appropriate expectations, I think you can go in and have the exact same fun experience about that. I think that's a much harder thing to communicate than Jeskai Control. Jeskai Control, again, like you said, has a meaning.
Yeah.
And unless people listen to this podcast and know you quite well, they might not know what Anthony's normal battle box means.
It's just normal battle box. It's complex
stuff.
And nuanced. So I think that this actually comes up in another area that I think is pretty interesting. Have you played Jumpstart on Arena at all?
No, I don't play Arena.
Yeah, I don't play it much either, but I actually have enjoyed Jumpstart quite a bit because it is like what I want from Arena. It's just like, here, grab a random deck, jam some games, see if you can like make the deck do the thing.
Remind me of how the actual, because you end up with two halves of a deck. How do you end up with two halves of your jumps? Do you like choose selectively, or do you
so
like draft them?
There's a little bit of choice. They say, here's the cover image for 3 different options. So it's like, do you want vampires? Do you want dogs? Do you want a growth? I don't know, some random theme. So you get to pick one, and then they give you a second choice of 3. So you don't have complete control, but it's also not completely random. You can be like, I don't really feel like playing another blue deck. And in this iteration, it's actually a little bit different, where the first choice might influence the second choice a little bit, so they can add some more narrow things and like do some color combinations. But what's really interesting if you play that a bunch is, like we're talking about, there's a huge range of things. Like, we should just say that. Like, that's what makes it fun. You can be like, here's the Phyrexian pack, here's the Teferi pack, here's the dog pack. Like, there's just all kinds of...
And those aren't even the same kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. That's I love that heterogeneousness to it. But a lot of the instant speed interaction is very similar across a lot of these decks. So you can be pretty confident, if they're playing green deck, their pump spell is going to cost 2 mana, and it's probably going to be +3/+3. And there's some variation, but even within that variation, a lot of those within each color, there's an expected like cost and scale to it. So you really can, even within all this sort of like diverse range of threats and diverse range of synergistic components to these decks, make a plan because you know what kind of instant speed interaction your opponent's going to have. And I think that is like a really subtle thing that makes that format work a lot better.
This made me think of a whole other aspect of this, which I think is actually really critical too, which is when you said that, I was like, well, obviously they figured out what kind of removal and interaction was balanced for the environment, and then they just, did it in all the decks. Because why would you have to make that decision to like rebalance every single removal package for every single deck? This environment is one environment that's going to have a certain metagame to it, for lack of a better word. You find the removal that works and you put it everywhere. Which reminds me that, like, something I haven't really thought of before is that if you do have this wide range of, like, combat tricks, or I don't want to choose combat tricks to make it sound like I'm continuing to dunk on combat tricks. It could be anything, right? It could be anything where you have a really wide range of disparate types of effects that do a similar-ish thing, but wildly differently and at different values and mana costs or whatever. In that situation, I think it's really hard to identify specific power outliers in an efficient way. If you have a cube, we have 8 different 2-mana counterspells that all are basically 2-mana counterspells. It doesn't take as much playtesting to figure out whether a 2-mana counterspell is fair or appropriate in your environment, because there's a lot more of them. You get to cast that effect more, evaluate it more, you hear your players groan about it more. It's just a thing that comes up more often that I think if you're trying to balance your environment, which is a journey we're all on as cube designers, having more of the same kind of effect makes it easier to know whether or not it's an outlier in terms of power level or gameplay.
That's true. I mean, to again, play the other side, because there's no, like, objectively correct, but it is also, as a player, a fun decision to figure out, do you want a disfigure versus a murder? Because maybe this particular environment just has big stuff, and you really need that kill spell that'll hit anything to make your deck work, because that you might be playing different strategies that need different types of removal. So there is definitely value in having that diversity and adds interesting deck building decisions. But,
for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that it makes that information and that card evaluation more portable when you have more similar effects is definitely true.
I guess what I'm saying is, if you take that comparison, disfigure versus murder, I think in a cube that runs both of those, in many more circumstances where the change in the effect and the cost is that disparate, one of them is just objectively much better. Where if you look at Disfigure versus Fatal Push, there it's still a choice. Your players are still making a choice, but it's 1 mana instant speed removal that removes small things but not big things, still has a variety in it, but it's more likely that your environment, both of those are going to be equivalently powered, and you're not going to have this big range. Whereas if you are trying to get a huge range of effects, it's more likely there's going to be a big power disparity between them that might be hard for you to identify.
I believe that.
And I'm not arguing for people making their environments more similar, certainly, because I do love the variety. I think that's, if anything, a justification for why, even though I do love variety, I think my cube has trended towards similar kinds of effects. It's like, I know this works. Like, I know this is not a trap. I know this is something the control decks will like. It's something the aggro decks will like because they can multi-spell. I know that it doesn't overly punish certain types of creatures that have big toughness. Like, I know this kind of effect is something that works in my environment, and so I do want more of it. I want to talk a little bit about I don't want to say disagreements, the change in perception that I've had with a couple playtesters and what matters in this environment, because I think it highlights another thing I like about having a very specifically oriented battle box, because I think this battle box will, if played a bunch, make me a little better at a control mirror or playing a control deck in general, because you have to make certain kinds of decisions in this battle box you don't have to make in other contexts of playing Magic. One area that we couldn't come to some sort of reasonable consensus on is how often it felt right to sorcery speed your instant speed stuff, just to main phase your instance on your own turn.
Main phase counterspell.
Well, not that one, although sometimes. I actually thought that this box was pressuring me a little bit to do that more than I expected. The vast majority of this box is instant speed. In terms of being actual instance, there are a bunch of creatures with flash. It's a lot of things that can happen in instant speed because that's what I intended it to be. It's a control mirror battle box. There's going to be a lot of interaction on the stack. There are some things that are just sorcery speed, but more importantly, I think oftentimes if your opponent just took a turn and did something on it, used some of their resources, they're basically opening a window for you of some width. Let's say I've got 6 mana and I spend 3 mana on a card draw spell. Now I only have 5 mana left. That opens a window for me now to say, do I think I can push something through that 5 mana window at sorcery speed, even if it's an instant, right?
So you mean like a draw spell or like a big creature with
flash? Could be anything. Could be anything. So like examples are like Sphinx's Revelation is in the battle box. It is an instant. In theory, the normal heuristic for Sphinx's Revelation is hold up all your counter spells for the entire game. Whenever you have a turn where your opponent either plays something you decide you don't need to counter for whatever reason, or they just have nothing worth countering and you have a window, just on their end step, dump a bunch of mana into your Sphinx's Rev, see if it resolves. I actually think in a lot of situations here, you want to main phase something like that, because if your opponent is tapped out now, and almost everything in the box is instant speed, which is true of the control mirror, they're not likely to tap out on their own turn. It's very unlikely that that's going to be the turn they decide to tap out on their sorcery speed thing. So it's kind of like this game of chicken, where there's these little incursions, right? Where it's not like nothing happens in the first few turns of the game. You are casting little cantrips and like card draw spells, and deciding how much to fight over them is a whole other decision. But I think oftentimes you actually end up, I'm just going to main phase this Restoration Angel because I have a pretty good idea that it's actually going to land right now. And once you untap and draw another card, the chances of it actually landing go down significantly. And that's, I think, an interesting decision point that came up. And I don't have a lesson for this. I don't know if I'm right, but I found myself casting instants on my own turn a lot more than I thought, and it felt correct for me to do in those situations.
That's what's important about Magic, is having it feel correct.
That's one thing. Another thing that we disagreed on a little bit was how much to value simple 2-for-1s when your opponent casts them specifically. So obviously a lot of his box comes down to, what do I bother trying to counter and what do I just let you do? And my opponents largely have just said, oh, you're going to cast a Hieroglyphic Illumination? Go for it. You can just have that. That's fine. Or you're going to cast a Fact or Fiction or Rain of Revelation. Some of these like draw spells that aren't game enders, right? It's not like, oh, my opponent resolved Rain of Revelation, now I can't win.
Some people would call Fact or Fiction a game ender, but I take your point.
I know that, FOF, EOT, yeah, I know that stupid thing, but I don't think it's a game ender in this situation, nor in most other situations, frankly, except for the situation people are talking about originally. Anyway, people would agree probably that the resolved Rain of Revelation or Hieroglyphic Illumination is not a game ender, right? It's not like you're casting a Sphinx's Rev for 8 on your opponent's end step, which you can do. That feels like a real game ender to me. So the question is, do you bother trying to counter that, right? Especially if it's like turn 6, you get to your end step, your opponent goes to Rain of Revelation. Do you counter the Rain of Revelation, knowing that your opponent might also have a counter spell? And here the counter spells are kind of zero-sum. Like if I counter my opponent's Rain of Revelation and they counter my counter spell, that's not a blowout for me. It's like I traded counter spell for counter spell. You still got to resolve your Rain of Revelation, right? It's not like I get totally ruined by that. Honestly, even at that point, presenting my opponent with that choice of like, I'm willing to spend a counterspell on your Rain of Revelation. Are you willing to protect it? You might even have the counterspell. Are you going to use it? Those were all interesting decision points where you have a lot of cards in your hand because you don't play a ton in the early turns, and most of what you play does replace itself, and all of your lands are coming from outside the game. So you do kind of get to max hand size at some point in the mid game. You end up cycling these burn spells that you don't have a Snapcaster Mage or a Dual Caster Mage or a Vendilion Click to point them at, and just, hitting your opponent in the face, which I think is fine. It's what I was going for, to be completely honest. The question then becomes, is it worth fighting over card draw? And I think it is, actually. That's my current assumption of this battle box, is like, if you try and cast a Rain of Revelation and I have a way to stop it, I'm going to try to stop it, because there's all of a sudden information, and I think that even though people have a lot of cards in their hands, stopping them from getting those little 2-for-1s over the course of the game is how you amass an advantage to eventually win a counter war at the end of the day. And this again, like the playing the tap lands, like the instant speed stuff on my own main phase, I don't know if this is correct, but these are the kinds of play patterns that I am exploring with the battle box that I have no other place to explore this, right? It just drops you into a specific kind of game where this stuff all of a sudden really matters, where it doesn't often matter in regular Magic, but it does come up. And so I had that thought while playing this. It's kind of an exciting sandbox for learning a particular set of skills in Magic, right? Similarly, like your battle boxes, I think, are a great sandbox for learning particular set of skills surrounding combat and when to take a risk, when to make a bluff, when to play around combat tricks, when to not. Like those are the kinds of decisions that having those things in that environment promote. Here, it's a whole different set of decisions, but I just think it's interesting that you end up creating an environment where you get to focus on the kinds of decisions you care about, which is what all cubes and battle boxes are, but it's especially pronounced with this very extreme, unorthodox battle box with these certain restrictions. Are you going to counter the Rain of Revelation, Anthony, on your opponent?
I think that is a really difficult question, and there's going to be so much other context. Like where I see that being the most, that question really forces itself is like end of turn, on turn 4, your opponent casts Rain of Revelation. Are you just going to use your counterspell now and just let them cast a Baneslayer on their turn?
That depends on a lot of other factors. Do I already have another removal spell in hand for it? Because, yeah, it depends. Everything depends. But my baseline, I think, is if I have an opportunity to use less mana and one card to counter a thing that costs you more mana and is going to get you more cards, I'm going to try and do it.
Yeah, I definitely think in a lot of cases, like the card advantage is the game you're playing here, right? Like, just thinking, my opponent has the threat, is that really the right question? I'm not sure. It might just be that each of these cards has some percentage of being the threat, and if you have more of them, you will win more games because you will have more actual ways to win the game.
And that's a great example of, I hope situations like that actually come up in playtest in the battle box, where it's like, I did have an opening hand that had Rain of Revelation and Baneslayer Angel. I'm going to play my untapped lands, and I'm going to do that sequence, and I'm going to ask you to answer that question, and I'm going to resolve one of the two probably at that point early in the game. The chance that you have two mana counter spells both in your hand is less likely, and so I'm going to get to resolve one of these, which is a pretty big game early on. So I'm hoping that stuff comes up, because I don't want those early turns to be always a foregone conclusion. If I had one criticism of this battle box, it's that so far the early turns do feel like, yeah, you just do this, and then the game begins on turn 6 or 7 or whatever, when the actual spells that matter get cast and decisions have to be made. I hope that's not the case long term. I hope that through more playing, we find play patterns that actually, those smaller decisions that felt obvious do actually matter, and actually you do counter this thing here. You don't let them anticipate on turn 2. You just counter it, because that's a 1-for-1. They don't get the card selection, and it's better for them not to have the card selection than for you to be out of counterspell. I don't know.
I could see that.
Anthony, it's time for another round of single card discussion, unless you have other thoughts about this battle box.
Well, I just wanted to ask a single card question, which is, how great does it feel to draw a Snapcaster Mage in this environment?
I haven't done it yet, so I don't know, but I bet it feels pretty good. I don't think it's a power outlier, though. It's just a 4-mana counterspell.
Yeah, fair.
I mean, it's a 4-mana counterspell that has upside of occasionally being a 9-mana Inspired Ultimatum, which is also pretty good, I suppose.
And it's a 10-turn clock.
It is. And there's enough small creatures running around here that I do think that the incremental burn I included, which is largely going to your opponent's face, you're just going to Sacred Fire your opponent's face. there's enough removal that you are sometimes going to get a Snapcaster Mage or a Brazen Bar or a Vendilion Click with one of these little burn spells, and it's going to matter. Should we go right to I guess you kind of kicked off single card discussion there with the question of how good it feels to draw a Snapcaster Mage. I don't know. I'm excited to find out. Here are the cards that have surprised me so far in this battle box. One is Finale of Promise. And I will admit, I've been trying to find a place to play this card because I think it is delightful and cool, and I just wanted to play it somewhere.
This is one of my absolute favorites in my Adeliz Wizard Tribal EDH deck.
I bet it is a great place to play it. I bet it is. This is a sorcery. It costs X red, and it says you may cast up to one target instant card and/or up to one target sorcery card from your graveyard, each with converted mana cost X or less without paying their mana costs. So, on the front, you pay 4 mana, you get a 2 mana instant and a 2 mana sorcery from your graveyard cast with Finale of Promise. Then, if X is 10 or more, you copy each of those spells twice. So if you cast it for 12 mana, which is the most mana you can have in this battle box, you get to cast a bunch of stuff from your graveyard and blow it up. So what I like about this is that it is both a like kind of incremental card. It's like just, tax your additional removal spell by 2 or something, force you to play at sorcery speed, but you get another copy of a removal spell or whatever, just like a Snapcaster Mage, kind of. Nowhere near as good, obviously. Then it's also this late game mana sink win condition where I did win a game where I cast the Finale of Promise for X equals 10, and what I ended up copying was a burn spell and a ponder, and just managed to get my opponent dead by burning their face out, basically. I think it's a cool card that has a cool home here. I'm not sure if it's going to be good enough in the long term because it does require a lot of setup. It's going to happen naturally over the course of the game. Honestly, I think it holds me back on loving this card here is that there aren't that many sorceries.
Right.
And then sometimes there's going to be an Inspired Ultimatum, and then that's great. I mean, like, I just can't wait to Inspired Ultimatum into Finale of Promise with X equals 10 on Inspired Ultimatum, or try and find a situation where I could possibly resolve that. Sounds pretty fun to me.
I mean, it's always easy to add. I guess if you're sticking to the strict 100-card limit, it makes it a little bit more difficult, but throwing in some sorcery speed, cheap cantrips, it sounds like they wouldn't actually affect the texture of the games all that much and might make some of these cards a little bit more effective. I feel like for me, the really exciting part about this card is getting like a whole bunch of prowess triggers all at once, which doesn't really apply here, but it still does stuff.
Yeah, I guess I didn't say it explicitly, but like I didn't put any of the prowess creatures in here. Like Monastery Mentor would be very good here. I didn't include it intentionally. I also didn't put any of the Teferis and stuff in here. Like this box, if I was power optimizing, it would just be nothing but Teferis and Dak Fadens and whatever all the way down. And I'm just not interested in that kind of play pattern where you have all this incremental advantage. I want big haymakers in the spirit of the original Jeskai Control match that I'm trying to emulate. The next card I want to talk about is, well, I could either be Cataxian Probe or Peak, either one.
Cataxian Probe also stood out to me as a card that seems kind of pushed here.
The information is obviously very important. What I'll say about it is I think it's interesting in a couple of ways. One way is that this is the environment I've played where I am least excited to just fire off Cataxian Probe the moment I draw it, right? Every other context I've played Git Probe in, I just turn one Git Probe every single time, right? I just do it.
Sure, that's when you have the most information in most contexts, right?
I think at that point, you just want the extra card because most of the Magic is much faster than this. You just want the other card immediately, and you want to know what your opponent's whole hand is because in a lot of Magic, your hand is much emptier by turn 5 or 6.
Right, that's what I mean. You get more information because you're seeing a whole bunch of cards. And if you have other cheap interaction and counter spells, you want to be able to set up the plan for the next couple turns.
Right. The Git Probe tells you what is my opponent aiming to do in this game. Because you have your opening hand, you're supposed to have a plan. And so what is their plan? I want to know it, and I want to play in a way that can optimize my chances to win against it. Here, you kind of want to use it at a time where it's like, do I have a window right now? Or what kind of interaction am I up against? Very often you find out, no, I do not have a window right now. And so what you then have to do is keep track of the cards you've seen, obviously, and then know how many unknown cards your opponent has to like get this decreasingly specific information about what your window actually is. It also opens up, in this situation, I think more so than in any other place I've played Git Probe or Peak, the opportunity to bluff. I Git Probe you, I see your hand, I know what interaction you have, now I run out of banger. Are you gonna try and fight me on it? Are you gonna like say, surely you are just running this out into my known counter magic because you are bluffing? Like, what do you do in that situation?
I mean, you got to try and counter it, right?
I think it's
what are you gonna say?
Obviously, it all depends
because you're still then trading counter spells, so it's not like you're losing card advantage. I mean, there are situations where that could be difficult.
I think you usually still just call them on it most of the time, but it just depends on a lot of other factors. And certainly, you could bluff a certain type of counter magic you just don't have or whatever and make it happen. So that I think is another interesting layer of this, that you kind of want to hold on to it to the right time to cast it, and then you also have an opportunity to bluff with it. And as of yet, I haven't found either of these to be like, oh, and now the game is a foregone conclusion, because there is so much card draw, right? Like I had a game where my opponent get probed me, and I was like, all right, great, time to Faithless Looting away all the cards you know about, because I just want different cards now, because that information is valuable to me. So that can happen. And it hasn't been like, oh, now someone's been get probed, the game is just not interesting anymore. That has not happened. So I've liked those cards here. I think they're playing out nicely. And the bluffing thing was interesting to me. I didn't expect that. I was like, oh, I could bluff here. I could like pretend that I'm not worried about that thing in their hand.
It's also really easy to understate the effect of the fact that the deck has no lands in it. That makes such a huge difference. When
it does. It really does.
You've seen 4 cards, and then your opponent draws their 5th card, and you think, well, there's a 40% chance it's a land. It might just not actually affect anything. When they are always drawing a meaningful card, that really just changes things a lot.
And in some ways, it makes cantrips a little less powerful, because a lot of their power in normal Magic is, again, smoothing out your draws. Like,
right.
One of the reasons I'm happy to put a Get Probe in my deck, was a lot of them, in a cube where I'm drafting my deck and I have basic lands in my deck, is that it's going to make my deck effectively a little thinner, make it a little easier for me to be consistent. Here, that's not a concern. It's just replacing itself. And I also think the decision of whether to pay 2 life or a blue mana for Get Probe is real here, because games do come down to attrition, and you just die to, like I said, a Finale of Promise on a burn spell. And it's like, if I just hadn't Get Probed you for 2 life, I'd be fine, but now I'm dead. Which brings me to the card that I think I'm most happy about in this battle box, and it was truthfully the very last one I added to get to 100 for the first version of the list, and I added it kind of begrudgingly. I was like, whatever. Just this card's fine. I'm sure I'll find something better after I do some play testing, but I want to like stick it in there for now because it kind of fits. That card is Galvanic Iteration. This is blue and a red for an instant. When you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy, and it has flashback for 1 blue-red. This card is just the bee's knees. It does everything. First of all, it's just a 2-mana copy of another card you need in your hand, with the caveat that you have to play a little different with it when you have counter magic, but you can still copy a counter spell, right? Like, you can turn this card into a copy of counter spell, basically, if you have another copy in your hand.
Right.
Even 2 copies if you really wanted to, right? If you get into a situation where you have a big counter war and you can afford to Galvanic Iteration, flashback Galvanic Iteration, then cast a counterspell, now have 3 copies of that to point wherever you want. It could be quite powerful. It also just turns into another copy of a removal spell if you need another removal spell, another copy of a draw spell if you need to draw action. And then also, this, similar to Finale of Promise, but way better, in a way that I love so much more, just is a late game win condition. Copying any spell twice is very powerful and turns a lot of burn spells into a huge problem for your opponent and just wins you the game. One of the games we played ended on a Galvanic Iteration, flashback Galvanic Iteration, cast Inspired Ultimatum, and just you need 3 counter spells now. And so do you have them? And my opponent actually had like 4 ways to draw cards instant speed. They countered one, they countered another, they drew a bunch of cards, they couldn't find the last counter spell, and that's how the game ended, just by the skin of their teeth. And it was beautiful. I loved it. It was so great. This card has been just...
So they had like 4 chances, and they just missed on every one of those chances. And
But no, it's different, and you know it's different. You're trolling me. Because, they had these card draw spells, but they had to ration how many card draw spells do I want to use, which ones. Like, this one's more likely to find me what I need, but it costs more mana, so it narrows the range of what I can find that'll be a successful hit. Like, it wasn't just that. And also, their chances were probably not 94% to do it.
Could have been.
It could have been, but we'll never know, and that's a very important part of the game, is the hidden information. Hidden from everybody, because it's too hard to figure out mathematically. So, Galvanic Iteration is it's probably the card I'm most thrilled about in this box, and I think it also speaks most to what this box is. It's like, this is this little Swiss Army knife that you get to try and negotiate a game state where this is exactly what you need it to be, and you get this range of options of things you can copy with it, because most of the battle box is instant sorcery, so you're never itching for something to copy with it. And it can either be a small thing, like an incremental advantage. I'll copy a cantrip just to get a little card advantage, or I'll double copy my Inspired Ultimatum and present a very scary win condition you have to figure out some answer for, and it just works. I really like it.
Inspired Ultimatum is quite a Magic card.
It really is. I think it's perfect for this battle box. I have it tagged a finisher. It basically is a finisher, because this is another one where if you resolve it, you win, right? Pretty much. 5 damage to any target, you gain 5 life, you draw 5 cards. It is a sorcery, so you got to do it on your own turn. But this is basically, this is a Baneslayer Angel in this context, right? Same thing. Resolve it, probably win.
Dangerous language there.
I can't wait to get called out on it. Any other cards jump out at you, Anthony, that you want to discuss?
I think I want to at least mention that this original Absorb illustration is it's one of my favorite Magic cards to look at.
You know that I looked up a cost of an original foil Absorb.
Oh, that's got to be.
It's like $100.
That's even more than I was going to say.
I just, my gut reaction now when cards are, to my eye, overpriced is like, that's just speculators that are ruining my life. It's another area where NFT bros have invaded and they're using all their NFT gains to speculate on blue chip collectibles. That's all I think when I see $100 absorbs.
Are you wrong?
I don't think I am, and I'm mad about it.
I gotta point out another one. This Disrupt that I had in my opening hand with the huge Phyrexian portal ship. People are really skeptical about, we're going to Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Like, why are we bringing all this science fiction into... I feel like I've gone on this rant before. Bring all the science fiction into Magic. It's not what the Magic flavor is about, but it so is. I'm excited to have Further Brothers War, especially to get back into that sci-fi vibe.
You're really going to mention the Disrupt art, and you're not going to mention the extreme visual euphemism in it? That's not a thing that was raised to you?
Nope.
It is a known thing. I just feel like we should mention it so we don't get letters. We know people. At least I knew, and now Anthony knows. I'm
going to look at it.
It's pretty Yonic, and they're shooting a white beam
of
energy
sure, yeah. I mean, that's fine.
At the Yoni. It's a whole thing.
I see Portal Ship first.
I'm glad you see Portal Ship first. All right, so that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. This battle box is still a work in progress. As I said, I would like to get in more testing so I can see how it feels. And I am going to build with some paper, Anthony. I think I own 80% of this battle box already. And the cards I don't own are not going to be expensive, save for exactly one Snapcaster Mage, which maybe I'll just proxy for now. Maybe it'll be an excuse to treat myself to another Snapcaster Mage. We will see.
I think the Judge promo Snapcaster Mage would really look great here.
Oh, wait, I forgot. The best part of his battle box, Anthony. Guess what?
What?
No tokens.
No tokens?
Not a single token shall be made by any card in this battle box. I did have to exclude like 2 cards I wanted to include because they made treasure tokens or whatever, but I think it's worth it to have no tokens in this whole battle box.
Wow, well, you beat me by 3.
I beat you by infinity percent.
Depends how you want to do the math.
100% is what we would say there, not infinity percent. Anyway, I think that's a great part of this battle box. I will say that's a pro. Here's another con, just right on the tail end of this episode. Not fast. Battle box is great because you can play fast. These games, not fast. They do not go quickly. You were not picking this up between rounds of your draft at the LGS and being like, yeah, I'll just throw down a cool 35-minute Jeskai Control Mirror. It's not a speedy game.
It's just important to know what your goals are and set expectations appropriately.
But similarly, like we've talked before, the games are not fast. I don't think if we mapped it out, you're making any more decisions. It's just that each one feels more important and you make them more slowly. We've talked about this. This is something you harp on a lot, that it doesn't matter if your whole cube is a step slower because you're still making the same series of decisions. You just had to play a couple more lands first. Here, you got to play 7 lands first, and then you start making decisions. And I don't actually think at the end of the day you make many more decisions than you make in a normal retail limited game or a normal cube draft game. But each of them feels pretty important. Am I really willing to tap some mana right now for this? And which of these card draw spells and which of these cards am I going to keep? And how am I going to scry? The decisions feel difficult and time consuming.
I feel like you do in this specific context. My hunch is you do make a lot of decisions because a lot of the decisions you make are to defer and wait and not do the thing yet. So each of your cards is
the non-decisions are decisions. That's
am
true.
I casting A or B? It's I didn't cast A 6 turns in a row, and it was this single card actually cost me 6 different decisions.
Yeah, you could be right about that. That's true.
If you'll buy that.
Every single end step is a series of cards you are not casting. And which ones are you not going to cast? And maybe that means you cast 1 or 2.
It's a difficult choice.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. I'm going to say tentatively, that's it for BattleBox content right now. We may touch back on these soon, but I think we've kind of gotten a little bit out of our system. We will be back on the Cube grind next week with something. And when do Kamigawa Neon Dynasty spoilers start? I think very soon.
I think this week.
I think very soon. I think before this episode even comes out, we will have official spoilers. So we got to get on that Kamigawa tip.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what new wild thing they do that's going to break the survey that I have to fix.
Yep. I do like the mech suits already that we're seeing. I'm excited about mech suit vehicles. I'm ready. Bring me giant robots. I'm ready for giant robots in my Magic.
I'm here for it.
All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by designing weird battle boxes, playing them with people on the internet, and then sitting in Anthony's basement and talking about it. Thank you for talking about Magic with me, Anthony.
Thanks for talking about Magic with me,
The Legless Wonder. Number 498, Jedediah Dry as Dust. Number 499, Loving Vincent Hugs a Lot. Number 500, The Rambling Boris Wander. Number 501, Business Class Klaus Riehl. Number 502, Emergency Exit Aisle Gustav Nook. Number 503, Unnervingly Candy Nikki Thane. Stand by. Number 504, Snoop's Lightstep Trenchcoat, The Hobo P.I. Number 505, William Carlos Williams. Number 506, Beef Grease Porter Drip Chin. Number 507, Exoskeleton Chester Fields. Number 508, Roth IRA Romeo Leeds, The Well Prepared.
I think we should save the kitchen items tier list.
Okay. Do you want to just ask the question?
What?
What is the question that you're asking? I wrote down some notes about kitchen items, but
You're probably not familiar with the tier list as a format of media, are you?
I definitely am. Yep, tier list, like a call sheet.
This is a very common thing. The call sheet. It's a very common thing in gaming subcultures to take all the available options in a game and put them in a tier list. And this is just an arbitrary order based on the subjective opinions of the person making the tier list, where they basically group things into tiers and put them in that list. Some people do it for Magic cards, but rightfully they are criticized for it because Magic is all context dependent, so you can't really make a tier list for this kind of stuff in Magic unless you assume no context. You could say in a vacuum that Counterspell is better than Cancel. Again, kind of, until your opponent has a Chalice on 2. But you can't compare more different complicated cards. If you're talking about Super Smash Brothers, you as a player can say, here's all the characters in Super Smash Brothers, here are the ones I think are better, here are the ones I think are worse. And I'm actually interested in this format because I think I have this experience very often, which I think is a somewhat universal experience, where if I'm asked to rank 50 things, I don't think linearly like, here's the best one, go down. I automatically group them like, well, here are the good ones. Here are the like medium good ones that are all clearly a step worse than those ones. And then here are the bad ones down here. Like I always kind of naturally put them into groups. And I think that natural inclination is the root of tier lists. So you get as many tiers as you want. I would recommend at least 4. And normally it's S above all else. S tier, A, B, C, D would be like your, let's say 4 or 5.
Said 4.
Do 5. 5. Do 5 as a baseline, and then if you feel like you need more, you can go to more. And what I would like you to do, I'm going to do the same thing, I've already started mine, is rank all kitchen accessories. So we're not including ingredients, we're not including appliances. Get your refrigerator and stove out here. We all know you need a refrigerator and stove.
Can delete some questions from my notes here.
So no ingredients, no appliances. Do you have other questions about the tier list?
I mean, I'm going to get mired in the context matters, and a kitchen is a whole system. It's not, I can't...
It's your kitchen.
But I wouldn't say like, the cutting board's more important than the mixing bowl. If I don't have one of those two things, I'm going to struggle to make a meal. I need both of those things.
You know you don't need both of those things. If you went to an Airbnb for the weekend and they didn't have a mixing bowl, you'd be like, I can't cook. Sorry.
Pretty much.
No, come on. You wouldn't. You would get out a regular bowl.
A little bit more.
You would get out a regular bowl and you'd mix the thing in the regular bowl and say, this is sure not ideal, but I can actually
I think
cook.
Mixing bowls are pretty important. Let's say a cutting board and a knife. You need those two things together.
Well, one might argue you put those in S tier. I'm not going to say I put those in S tier, but one might argue you would put those two things in S tier.
But also, how do we, is a cutting board a thing? I have
Yes.
very strong... Well, is it one thing?
No.
Or do I say there's a crappy cutting board and there's a great cutting board?
You can decide however you want. You have to embrace the fact that the tier list, despite its objective appearance, is inherently subjective. That's what a tier list is.
All right, S tier, you gotta have your Japanese
Hold on.
poultry knife.
Spoilers.
That's number 1.
You can put it there if you want. If you feel like that's important, and we will discuss these kitchen item
It's
tier
one of my
lists.
favorite kitchen objects that I delight in. I don't think anybody needs one.
This is your tier list, Anthony, for your kitchen and your cooking.
I'll think about
That's your homework. I got my homework. We will have a tier list comparison on an upcoming episode.
I'm just in my head going down a rabbit hole of, can you make an end grain cutting board out of Magic cards?
I'm going to say yes, you could.
Let's do it.
But are you just thinking that because you have so many Magic cards? It's just the raw material you have the most of?
Yeah, I would
It
say...
would ruin your knives. It's a thing you could do it, but it would be awful for your knives, I'm pretty sure. Paper is notoriously terrible for keeping a sharp edge in a knife. Now, I admit I'm a little confused by that statement because the paper's just made of wood, right? It's all the same stuff. It all comes from trees. But my understanding is that the way paper is processed, using a knife on paper is awful for it.
Okay, we'll have to come up with another purpose for all these arts and craft grade Magic cards.
We're going to open the Lucky Paper store for the first time ever. All we're going to sell is 4 Magic card end grain cutting boards we could make from all of Anthony and my total utter jank.
Number 563, Lowly Highlight. Number 564, Elihu Skin Pockets. Number 565, Marion May Wyoming Song. Number 566, Stitches the Railyard Suture Man. Number 567, Clonopin Clyde. Stand by.